If I was in popular movies, I would, but I'm trying to up the audience numbers.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We're a consortium of 75 plus organizations in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And our guests today are two distinguished historians. Woody Holton is the McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, author of, among other books, Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia. More recently, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution, as well as other books on the beginnings of the Revolution, the formation of the Constitution, as well as a biography of Abigail Adams that received the Bancroft Prize. And also Robert Gross. Robert A. Gross is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History at the University of Connecticut, Emeritus, author of The Minutemen and Their World, first published at the time of the bicentennial, republished 25 years later, and now a 250th anniversary edition of the Revolution, not of the book, has just appeared. And also that received the Bancroft Prize when it appeared. And his more recent book is The Transcendentalists and Their World. So, and what we're going to talk about today is something that you two gentlemen have talked about, the Revolution. Did it begin in Massachusetts? Did it begin in Virginia? What's the difference? Who should be taking credit for this? And why did it happen? So, Woody, why don't you start us off?
I was going to let Bob go first because I think in the early phases, it's really Massachusetts more than Virginia. But I'm happy to go first and appreciate the chance to be here with my, I won't say my old friend Bob, but my long-term friend Bob Gross, author of that amazing Minutemen in Their World, which I recommend to the Revolution 250 audience. As if most of you probably already read it, but those who haven't, get the new edition.
Read it again.
And read it again, exactly. Read it again for the first time with a new preface and everything. I would say that the biggest thing I would say at the outset is how different the origins of the Revolution are in those two places. That there's a lot of commonalities, and you get books like Bernard Bailyn's amazing Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, which talks about America, the 13 colonies that rebelled, as one place. Most of the books that talk about the Revolution talk about it as a single place. There'll be variations, maybe a chapter on African Americans and a chapter on women or whatever. And in fact, I don't know. It's occurring to me that my own book about the Revolution was sort of said, "Hey, we can talk about it as a general thing." But I'm thinking I may be mistaken about that. I think the origins are so different in New England from what they are in Virginia that maybe we ought to be stressing the differences. That's one new thing we can do. 250.
Well, the Cavaliers go first. And they provoke the Puritans. And I went back today and reread the very long essay review I wrote of Forced Founders. And in that, I noted that initially from the Stand Back protests well into the early into the 1770s, Virginia and Massachusetts actually pretty much hand in hand in opposing British taxes and enforcement measures. And in that sense, you might well see the two largest colonies joining in a common ideology, a common political culture, a common set of economic interests broadly in the coming of the Revolution. But I think the big change really comes when Britain punishes Massachusetts with the series of measures we call the coercive or the intolerable acts. And most important in this is the Massachusetts Government Act, MAGA, as I call it, the first MAGA. And the Massachusetts Government Act revokes the charter of the colony from 1691, the Massachusetts Bay, and it turns the judiciary into an arm of royal government. It makes the council once elected by the lower house of Massachusetts General Court into an appointive body, and then it bars town meetings, except once a year to choose selectmen and municipal officers. And if you want to have any other meeting, you've got to ask the governor for permission and show the agenda in advance. That is a remarkable act in provoking fury in Massachusetts, but it poses some interesting questions about why the other colonies respond the way they do. Because the changes that Britain introduced in the judiciary and the council make Massachusetts a more normal royal government. Why should other colonies that had precisely those arrangements for appointive office holders not have responded to Massachusetts? What's your problem? That's how we've been living all along. So the surprise here is that Massachusetts, in its refusal to go along with the MAGA Act, puts itself far out there in opposing British policies, when it would have had good reason to doubt that it could get such support from the other colonies. Maybe Woody would like to talk about this.
Yeah, unless you wanted to end there, Bob. It looks like you wanted to say something yourself.
No.
No. I'll let you answer.
Okay,
I'll answer, Woody.
Well, I do think that the timing was just lucky for Massachusetts in that Virginia and Maryland, the primary tobacco colonies, were going through a terrible recession. I mean, it was a international recession started in Britain, but affected all through the British Empire. And one of the things that affected was the price of tobacco, which was everything in the Chesapeake. And it had fallen by about 40% between 1772 and 1774. And where that's relevant to the Revolution is that it made one of the forms of protesting Parliament that Massachusetts was suggesting very attractive. And that was to withhold our crops from Britain, but to delay the withholding for a year. Is actually Virginia insisted on that part, so that the effect of doing that, of saying, okay, starting a year from now, we're not going to send you any tobacco to Europe. Well, European tobacco purchasers pushed the price way up to try to stock up, to lay in for the lean years, as they say. And so Virginia and Maryland got to sell one of their it was second largest crop they ever sold was the 1775 crop, and they sold it at an astronomical price because the merchants were so hot to stock up on it. And so we could also talk about non-importation, but I think this non-exportation really made the difference. And Bob, of course, I remember that review essay you wrote in the Virginia Quarterly Review of my book. And Bob made the best point, or actually, I think you may have said this previously in a reviewing an article of mine. But the point is, I was trying to explain that this recession led in Virginia in Maryland to all these local efforts to withhold tobacco from the market, and then that was all before the MAGA and the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston, and all the other things that Britain did to Massachusetts. The Virginians were already trying to figure out how to withhold their tobacco. They weren't doing very well at it, but they were trying. And Bob proposed what I wish I had when I was writing my book, a name for these organizations. He wanted to call it the Organization of Tobacco Exporting Colonies, or OTEC. And it's completely relevant to this because, when OPEC was started in the 1970s, it was partly an anti-Israel thing, but also a way of driving up the price of their commodity, of the oil exporting countries, only major export of oil. And so you can see with his MAGA and with my OTEC, he and I are very much alive in 2024 and making those analogies. But this goes to my point about it's a different revolution in Massachusetts. It's about how dare you take away our charter. Imagine if they'd done the same thing, Bob, to Connecticut or Rhode Island, which had they elected their lower house, their upper house, and their governor. All Massachusetts did was elect. All they could elect was their lower house, and then it chose the upper house. And the old upper house chose the upper house, and the king chose the governor both before and after the Massachusetts governor acted in Massachusetts, as he did in Virginia. But it does show that tyranny is relative. That is, that just making Massachusetts a little bit as bad off as Virginia was enough to make them go nuts. And so I might even go so far as to say, while it was while it was an ideological revolution in both places, it was more ideological in Massachusetts as of 1774. And while it was an economic revolution in both places, it was almost all, it was more economical in Virginia, and certainly in that key year that we're living through the 250th anniversary of right now, of 1774. Although I hasten to add, there's a wonderful book by John W. Tyler called Smugglers and Patriots that says there's an economic origin to the revolution in Massachusetts. But that's really about Boston and the other ports. It's not about Concord, which Bob wrote about. And I think, Bob, isn't it correct? It wouldn't be accurate to say something like, when you were trying to write about the origins of the revolution in Concord before 1774, it was hard because there was no revolution in Concord before.
Right. Well, in fact, let me just broaden this in seeming digression, but Concord was once seen, as Minutemen broadly were, as a radical place ready to spring up and fight the British the moment taxes were imposed upon them. And that was long thought to be the story, and there was not much to research. We just knew, they meant to tax us, we meant to stop it. But in fact, Concord was pretty slow to respond to British measures with radical gesture. And without going through all the details, it was an unlikely place to put the Provincial Congress and to be the depot of supplies for organizing military resistance. Unlikely, that is, that it wasn't, a seedbed of hot militancy against Britain. On the other hand, a place that was opposed to British policies, but quite considered in the measures that it would adopt to oppose those policies, might in fact be a really good place to base your resistance, because you wouldn't have to worry about the radicals in Concord launching an attack on British forces without authorization. So that in that sense, Concord could be a moderate place to be a base, and it turns out it's surprisingly representative of many towns. Weston, for example, not far away from Massachusetts, was another place that took until the end of September of 1774 to appoint a committee of correspondence. Concord, the same thing. Acton didn't appoint a committee of correspondence until a week after Concord, and just 10 days before the Provincial Congress. So what you had here was a countryside with a kind of spotty movement towards resistance. And in that sense, it's quite, I would suggest, what's at the heart of this is that people are furious at Britain's assault on self-government, but they're not entirely sure how to resist them. And the royalists, soon to become loyalists, denounced Sons of Liberty and Samuel Adams and those for the longest time. And this is in Mary Beth Norton, 1774. They just denounced the Patriots because they claim that they're for the Constitution as a Britain, and yet, and they say they want to uphold the old institutions, and yet they're inventing committees of correspondence and circular letters between colonies for which there's no precedent anywhere.
Mhm.
And so, how do you resist the attack on self-government with forms that can be justified when there's no constitutional basis for the forms you're inventing?
Interesting. I'm just wondering, we had, at the end of last year, a big reenactment of the destruction of the tea. I'm wondering if there could be a similar reenactment of the withholding of tobacco, if that's something Virginia is planning,
No,
and how you would go about doing that.
no, because nobody in Virginia has read my. No, that's exactly. It is more of a. It's a kind of book you get assigned to read rather than pick up on purpose at Barnes and Noble. So I don't think there's going to be a reenactment of tobacco. But like I said, it's being reenacted right now as we even down here we're having to pay $3 a gallon again for gas. That's
Right.
It's the same process.
It's interesting how one thing captures the imagination and the other doesn't, and why that is.
Well, I have to mention, since you mentioned that one of my great discoveries as I was researching my first book called Forced Founders was that Thomas Jefferson swore in the 1780s that he'd never speculated in Western land. Mm-hmm. And I found 5 different land speculation ventures that he was part of. So he just, I'm probably going to get struck dead for saying that, but Jefferson simply lied about that. And I thought when people read my book and saw that, they were just going to be astounded. Mm-hmm. And no one was. But it was during those same years that my friend Annette Gordon-Reed was researching Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Right. And then along came the DNA. Right. And it kind of reminded me of, remember how Whitewater never got Bill Clinton, but his affair got him impeached? Sex sells better than land.
Sure does. It sure does. And just to get back to, and Jonathan reminds us that Yorktown is going to have a Tea Party reenactment, but apparently not a tobacco withholding reenactment.
Yeah.
Which maybe they should. I'm wondering, and Bob, when you were talking earlier, you mentioned the old chestnut about the Cavaliers versus the Puritans. I was thinking about the way the Revolution's been remembered over the years and explained over the years, and looking at kind of the simplest explanation, which sometimes does have a real element of truth to it.
Well, yeah, I think even in this conversation, Woody talks about economic interests. Mm-hmm. I was talking much more about ideology and commitment to a political culture of a certain sort. When I taught at Amherst College in the early part of my career, I was periodically asked to lead groups and trips to Concord. Mm-hmm. And we'd be there at the North Bridge, and I ended up always somehow talking about political ideals and commitments. Then I moved to William & Mary, and I was similarly asked to take people around and often international visitors. And there you begin America by talking about slavery and economic interests and the dominance of certain of upper class elites. At the North Bridge, you would be talking about liberty and self-government and conscience. Those are polarized views that won't hold up as a polarization. But nonetheless, if we were going to talk about the revolution in terms of economic interests, we could certainly go to John Tyler's book and talk about the smugglers. We could emphasize in Marblehead, all the center of the fishing fleet, how much the Fisheries Act set them off. So we could talk about all these economic interests, but it wouldn't get us at a key theme that I've been trying to think through in my own recent reading and work on the revolution. It's not what provoked colonial responses. It's how the colonists responded. What's the rhetoric? What's the language of opposition? What's the discourse? What are the ways in which people put together coalitions or not?
Right.
And in that perspective, I think what is striking is that loyalists and royalists often did use the language of economic interest. So did the people that Woody writes about, who see not economic interests just narrowly, but as the basis of a whole class system, which the great Virginia gentry, the slaveholding gentry, know what are the props of their power. As Woody said, land and control over slaves and doing mercantile work and speculating in the lands they seize from native people.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all props. But in Massachusetts, they're props too. But what really drives the rhetoric of revolution is what I call the appeal to the ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
The sense that our forefathers, the Puritans, fled the tyranny of Archbishop Laud and Charles I, risked their lives crossing the Atlantic, came to the American wilderness, carved out homes and farms only after long struggle and loss of treasure and blood, fought native peoples, and secured for themselves and their posterity civil and religious liberty.
Mm-hmm.
It's our duty to pass that on, preserve it intact, and give it to the succeeding generations. That's a rhetoric that is absent, I think, from the revolution elsewhere, except in Jefferson's summary rights of British America, in which he too tells a myth of how our ancestors didn't need anything from Britain when they sailed across the oceans and established our plantation. Mm-hmm. However, he doesn't have the same rhetoric of duty and obligation and religious caste.
Right, and Jefferson's emigres who went across the water for freedom were the Angles and the Saxons who fled to the place we now call England. So he had the same story, but put it further back. And I think you're right, Bob, that and look, there was certainly an ideological dimension to the revolution, even in Virginia, and it's completely consistent with the economic interests. That is life, liberty, and property. We got to protect our property. And unless you have a certain amount of property, you can't have that independence upon which virtue is based. Virtue is the big word for Balin, who I mentioned. And Tim Breen really made this clear in his book, Tobacco Culture, that to talk about economic interest and debt is also to talk about the genteel notion of personal independence is much more important long before political independence. These guys want to have their personal independence. They're more scared of slavery than people in Massachusetts are because they know what slavery's like close hand, because there's many more slaves there than in the 2% in Massachusetts. But I wanted to say something about that because you reminded me, Bob. I don't know if either of you guys knew this, that we claim in Virginia that the first Thanksgiving was here at Berkeley Plantation. I remember my father's a politician. We used to go down every year for the actual first Thanksgiving. And so, that's just another one of those battles between various states over who did what first. But I mentioned that as to sort of set up the opposition to the fact that there really was not, as Bob, I'm just underscoring what Bob said, there's not a historical memory that the Virginians were drawing from saying, we came over here for freedom in 1607 because we Anglican rich guys who made up the Jamestown settlement were so oppressed back in home, because they weren't oppressed. Certainly the elite were, the leaders were not the way the leaders of the Puritan settlement in Massachusetts or Massachusetts Bay or the Pilgrims down in Plymouth could claim. And so I think, it's a great point, Bob, that they had a spiritual history that the Virginians didn't have. Not saying the Virginians were irreligious, but they didn't have this spiritual history of wandering it, this errand into the wilderness. Although I also want to add another book, John Frederick Martin's Prophets in the Wilderness, is my favorite title of any book, because prophets, you don't know whether to spell it. He spelled it F-I-T-S, but you're supposed to think it's P-H-E-T-S. Prophet, because they were both, and they were consistent with each other, and so there was an economic motive in Massachusetts. But let me say one more thing. I really would say, Bob, that your Western Massachusetts farmers are much more ideologues, and I mean that in the best sense of the word. They were constitutionalists more so than the guys in Boston, because, for instance, when they, the reason that tea had to be thrown in the harbor was that the Patriots were afraid people would drink it. because it was
Right.
going to be cheaper than the Dutch
Yeah.
smuggled tea. And so I would say, to speak very crudely, but to advance this a little bit, I would say the revolution was primarily an economic movement in coastal Massachusetts and in all of Virginia, but not really in Western Massachusetts. They really were trying to protect their town meeting. That's
Hmm.
Bob mentioned correctly. There's all these things that didn't change or didn't change much in Massachusetts, but one thing that did change, and you can correct me on this, Bob, but I think you told me people just ignored it, but it's still interesting that it was said. The Massachusetts Government Act says you can only have one town meeting
Right.
a year to elect your officials.
Mhm.
And, we know it from the Norman Rockwell painting of the guy standing up in the town meeting, but people love those town meetings. And they're still astounding to me. I've never been to a New England town meeting because they still have them in towns like
They do.
Concord.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
they could vote at that town meeting to change the name of Concord to Lollapalooza. Right, they can do whatever they want because it's a
Well, they actually, remember, there's a myth involved here.
okay.
It's a myth that's like Thomas Paine's myth of how governments formed from the bottom up, when a group of people sit around a tree and all exchange
Right.
opinion and constitute themselves. No town was ever chartered to hold its own government
Huh.
until the general court authorized it. We talk about government from the bottom up, but in fact, it is always some interplay between higher authority and then the
Mhm.
base where people meet. Town meetings in Concord right now, we're still running the town through citizen input and participation, but we can only do so by having a whole lot of people who can devote 40 and 50 hours a week to being on, committees dealing with budgets and zoning and all sorts of things. So it's highly professionalized with town managers and the like. But let me come back to the sort of larger point here, which is that the attack on self-government is really crucial, and it transcends economic interests. And I think for a reason that we might see here as connected to something that runs through your work, Woody, and went through the progressive historians. Often we'll say, oh, progressive historians thought only economics drove politics. But they were also quite aware that the political order and people's place in it, groups' place in it, is itself needing to be considered. And so when you have a revolution, they say, when people challenge British power, you have different groups then contending for power because everything's being shaken up. And I think that was certainly true in Massachusetts when people came to the Provincial Congress. Some people were ready to argue, how dare we can't betray our forefathers. We've got to have that 1691 charter now. And we're going to act as if it's in effect. And others said, like the town of Worcester and others that you've looked at, say, you got to be kidding. We're in a state of nature. If we don't have our charter, and if we're in a state of nature, then we can reconstitute government as we want. We can be a simple democracy if we want. And so, in that sense, the very political struggle brings up ideological issues and principles about self-government that themselves drive conflict and cooperation in Massachusetts Bay. And I think it may be that, I'm thinking out loud here, that combination of ideology and politics can actually make for coalitions with other colonies, each of which has, after all, its own political system and its own ongoing conflict.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly one of the things that General Clinton said, that these people have so many differences, they will never figure out how to get along. And maybe the best thing the British could do is pull all of their forces out to Florida and Canada let these people fight it out for about 10 years and they'll get tired of killing each other and ask us to come back. That is, seeing these profound differences, and each of you have talked about the real risks and how they do come together at this moment from very different places is really, and each of you have written about that and thought about the next step after the great moment of declaring independence, and how do you create a union out of this really disparate group of colonies.
Yeah, Alan Taylor says, people see him as one of the neo-progressive historians who's critical, and he often is, of the founders. But he also says you got to hand these guys credit when you look at everything they're up against. For instance, class conflict, enslaved people taking them on, women making new demands. The West, as Bob was just saying, these towns like Worcester are, Boston was really being challenged by Worcester when Worcester said, we want to go back to this Charles I era constitution. When we got to elect the governor, and Boston didn't want Worcester electing the governor because who knows what kind of taxes Boston would pay in order to take taxes lighter on Worcester. And so, yeah, I agree.
Let me add something else. People in Massachusetts had long memories. You know who was the first British official to recommend that town meetings be abolished except once a year with the governor's consent?
Mm-mm.
Governor Andrews, before the overthrow.
Before they threw him in jail.
Before
they threw him in jail,
Yeah. Governor Andrews first thought to do that.
Yeah.
And then Hutchinson, in his letters and in his analysis, we really got to do something about it. And Barnard. So that this was, the Massachusetts Government Act picked up a long-standing agenda for repressing popular participation in governance in Massachusetts. And people knew that.
Bob, I'm going to use that as an entree to plugging. Some people will be watching this before an event that you and I are both participating in. We're doing this on October 8th, but on Friday, October 11th, that's the actual anniversary of the first meeting of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress in Concord. And we've got a whole day. We've got a law professor. We've got an expert on freedom and democracy coming up from the University of Connecticut. And I just saw the schedule, Bob. Governor Gage is going to be there too, so I might show up. But it's going to be a lot of fun, I think. And all these issues, Bob. I've read your essay, the talk you're going to give there, and I really like this inheritance theme, because you also had, and I don't know if you have time to mention it now, but it has a dark side too, doesn't it? But all of this is going to.
Yeah, I need to do a lot more work on this, I think. But Americans like the Revolution of Jefferson's preamble to the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and with endowed with rights. But the ideology of the revolution in Massachusetts, which equal to the ancestors, makes the case on far narrower ground. In effect, they're saying we owe it to the ancestors and posterity to maintain this legacy of civil and religious liberty. Well, that bases rights in the Charter, and even more on genealogical privilege. What room is there in that vision for the Africans and their children who were kidnapped, or that is to say, sold out of Africa and forced across the Atlantic to take up lives in bondage? It's the very opposite narrative of the Massachusetts Children of Puritans narrative in those, and yet hundreds and hundreds of people of African descent serve in the Massachusetts Armed Forces. So, and within the 5 Massachusetts signers of the Declaration of Independence, all first served in the Provincial Congress. So you have a kind of universalist nationalism, if you will, of Jefferson, and you have an ethnic nationalism of the descendants of Puritans. And yet, within a year, those ethnic nationalists can become universalist idealists. Is there a story of an ideological transformation that we haven't told?
Yeah.
Interesting. We've been talking with Bob Gross, the author of The Minutemen and Their World, and Woody Holton, author of Force Founders and other books. And that's really a profound moment to think about that transition. And Bob's been talking about this for a couple of years, about you go from preserving our charter rights to universal freedom. And that is a big transition we see happening. Is that the story of the revolution, or is there something else?
Well,
You know, if you take it a little bit further, just as you said that, look, the other colonies were they rallied to Massachusetts' side because Britain revoked the charter. And yet, everybody preoccupied by charter rights, Dr. Joseph Warren says that, let them take away charter rights and everything's gone. So they all share that point of view. And sharing that point of view about charter rights, they're all signing on to the Declaration of the Preamble. But of course, we do have to remember Pauline Meyer's emphasis that nobody really paid attention to the preamble to the Declaration until the 1830s and 40s.
Oh, can I tack on to that?
Yes, Woody.
If I had to say the single coolest discovery I've ever heard about the founding era, I wish I could say it's a discovery I made. It's not, but Bob gave the beginning of it, and that is that the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence did not view it as a human rights document.
Mm-hmm.
They viewed it as a states' rights document. And not states as in we now sing Virginia, Connecticut, but as in nation. Like Connecticut was a nation, as hard as that may be to believe, and so was Virginia and all the rest. And so, and the way you really see it as Eric Slaughter, who really I think he carried the ball quite a bit farther down the field than Pauline had, in pointing out that if you look at the last paragraph of the Declaration, you see the phrase "independent states" in all caps three times. And a couple of those times it says free and independent states, free and independent states, free and independent states. That's what they were all about. And so, and this always scares people when they hear it coming from me, coming from South Carolina. I think the proper term for the Declaration of Independence as written, but stay with me, if we're at the end of this, I'm going to be in trouble. As written, the Declaration of Independence was an ordinance of secession, justifying 13 parts of the British Empire from seceding from the rest of the British Empire. And it was only half of the British Empire in America because there were 13 other colonies that didn't rebel. And so its authors saw that. But then in the same year that they published the Declaration of Independence, a guy from Massachusetts named Lemuel Haynes, who had served in the Continental Army, wrote an anti-slavery pamphlet, not for himself because he was already free. His mom was white, his dad was black, but saying, called it Liberty Further Extended. And the epigraph of that was, we hold these truths to be self-evident, are created equal and endowed by the Creator and certain inalienable rights. And that was the first time anybody ever quoted that part of the Declaration of Independence. Lots of people were already quoting free and independent states. Free and independent. Washington quoted that. The state legislatures quoted that. But then what Eric found was that 70% of all of the people who quoted created equal during the first 25 years of the Declaration of Independence's life, that is up until 1800, 75% of the people who picked up on this obscure passage, all men are created equal, and decided to quote that, were like Lemuel Haynes and Benjamin Banneker and so many Quakers, anti-slavery people,
Right.
so that they kind of just shifted the spotlight of the Declaration of Independence from free and independent states to create it equal, and turned this secession document into, and then Lincoln finishes the job at Gettysburg when he says that's conceived in liberty, dedicated to the prospect that all men are created equal. They turned a secession document into a universal Declaration of Human Rights.
We could add, though, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud in town after town, church after church, in town meeting and county gatherings. People heard that. And we don't know what they heard, but they heard it often every year read aloud. And in that sense, those words may have gotten, more of a hearing and more of a valence than we would know.
And of course, on the parchment copy, States of America, states is the word capital in big letters. When the printed copy, it's United States of America. It's a change. I wonder if each of you have final thoughts for our listeners on the fascinating discussion.
Well, Woody, I want to ask you, where have we heard about all caps nationalism in our own time?
You're back to MAGA again. I think I said the main thing I really wanted to leave. Well, I wanted to plug our thing on Friday, October 11th. Is it free, Bob?
Yes, it is free, and you can come. It starts at 9:30 a.m. at the First Parish Meeting House. That's the site of the Congregationalist Meeting House that once stood there where the Provincial Congress met, and it held its committee meetings in Wright Tavern, right close by.
And there's going to be, I saw there's going to be, not only are we going to have the reenactor, Tom Muscage, but breakout sections to talk about the issues with democracy today. It sounds like a very New England way to spend.
And members of the state legislature will be there, and descendant of Benjamin Lincoln, who was secretary, a direct descendant of Benjamin Lincoln, who was secretary of the Provincial Congress, will be there. And we hope member school kids.
Great.
Yeah, that's it for me. Bob, do you want to say anything else?
No, I think we have found a way for Virginia and Massachusetts to say in South Carolina something to say to each other.
This is me shaking hands with your opinion, but it's very hard to do.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us. I want to thank Jonathan Lane, and I look forward to Friday in Concord and many occasions subsequently as we commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And every week we thank our listeners in and around the country. And this week I want to thank our friends. And if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org, or come see him in Concord on Friday for some of our magnets, playing cards, or other things. And so this week, friends in Boston, Lowell, Arlington, here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and in Alexandria, Fredericksburg, Hampton, and Falls Church in the Commonwealth of Virginia, as well as folks in Amman, Jordan, Jerusalem and Israel, The Hague, Edinburgh, Bangkok, and places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.